On November 24, 2011, 23-year-old Victoria Shakte sat in her wheelchair at the dining room table inside of her apartment in Innisfail, Alberta, Canada. On the kitchen table sat a fresh pizza, and then a balloon was tied to the back of one of the chairs. Victoria and her full-time caregiver, MrBallen, were celebrating. Marlene, who was originally from the Philippines, had just received her permanent resident status in Canada. This meant that Marlene now was able to receive a range of social benefits provided by the country, and she could now take steps towards becoming an official Canadian citizen. So this was a huge deal for Marlene, and Victoria was just so happy for her. But despite being such good friends and having so much in common and just really getting along, the two women really could not have looked more different. Victoria had dyed red and blonde hair, she had a pierced nose, and she loved wearing really bright colors, in particular red. As for Marlene, she was much more modest. She had dark eyes and dark hair that she always kept perfectly combed, and then even when she wasn't working, she dressed very sensibly. But for anybody who knew these two, Victoria and Marlene seemed like sisters most of the time, and Victoria relied on Marlene more than anybody else in her life. When Victoria was just 16 years old, she had been in this terrible car accident. Her friend, who was driving, was speeding at over 140 miles per hour when they lost control and flipped the car. The accident had left Victoria a quadriplegic, which meant she suffered significant paralysis below her neck. Now, at the time, Victoria's friends and family were obviously so relieved that Victoria had survived the accident. But, looking at her paralysis, her friends and family were worried that Victoria's life would ever go back to being even close to what it used to be. But even at a young age, Victoria had always been very resilient and put her faith wholly in God. And so through the years of extensive medical treatments, she always stayed positive and strong. And over time, she had actually regained some movement in her arms and hands, and she had sort of built a new life for herself. Now, that life was very different from the one she had growing up, but she still cherished it. And Victoria's life had only gotten better when Marlene had become her caregiver and physiotherapist 3 years earlier. In addition to helping Victoria with her physical therapy, Marlene helped prepare food, she got Victoria ready for the day, and she kept the apartment clean. Marlene also helped look after Victoria's 7-year-old daughter, Destiny. Back at the kitchen table, Marlene and Victoria ate their pizza and talked about how exciting it was that Marlene was now one step closer to becoming a Canadian citizen. After they finished eating, Marlene got up and began to clean the kitchen, and Victoria wheeled herself down the hall to her daughter's room. Destiny's door was cracked open, and Victoria could see her daughter sleeping soundly. Victoria smiled. There were times when she looked at her daughter and just felt like bursting out into tears of joy, because she believed her daughter really was a miracle. When Victoria had gotten into that car accident, she was 4 months pregnant. Victoria had been pinned in the wrecked car for 45 minutes before EMTs could get to her, and by the time she was taken to the hospital, she feared she had lost the baby. But 5 months later, her daughter had been born happy and healthy. Victoria chose the name Destiny because she felt like it had been her destiny to have this little girl. Then, years later, Victoria and her daughter had moved to the small town of Innisfail, which is said to get its name from an Irish word that meant Isle of Destiny. So, watching her daughter sleep soundly that night, Victoria felt like, everything that had happened in her life, including the accident that paralyzed her, had happened for a reason, and that she was meant to be exactly where she was right now with Destiny and with Marlene. Later in the evening, Victoria was starting to feel worn out, so she asked Marlene for some help. Victoria said she needed to make an important phone call. So Marlene pushed her down the hall to a small home office, and then she left. That way Victoria could have some privacy on her call. Then Victoria called her financial advisor, Brian Malley. Brian had been a friend of the family for years. He ran a successful construction business, and he had played a huge role in making Victoria's ground floor apartment more wheelchair accessible for her. Brian also owned a small financial firm in town where he worked with locals and people in the area, helping them invest, balance budgets, and manage their money. And managing money had been another major way that Brian had been helping Victoria. Years after her accident, Victoria had sued the person who had been driving the car that hit her, and she had been awarded a settlement of about 575,000 Canadian dollars. With so much money, Victoria had turned to Brian for some guidance, and he had worked to help her make some smart investments and to limit her spending. Brian answered the phone, and for a few minutes, he and Victoria just caught up on what was going on in their lives. Victoria told him the good news about Marlene becoming a permanent resident, and Brian told Victoria that he was excited because he was making the 2-hour drive to Edmonton for business, and so his wife could go to the opera. After a few minutes of this, Victoria finally brought up the reason that she had actually called. She needed Brian to move several $1,000s from her investment account into her checking account to cover her rent and bills and things like that. Victoria immediately heard Brian exhale sort of frustratedly. He told her he was getting concerned about her spending and that her investment account had really begun to dwindle significantly over the past year. Brian tried not to sound too harsh, but he told Victoria that he really couldn't understand why she wasn't sticking to the budget they had laid out for her. Victoria fell silent for a second, and then in a very quiet voice, she said to Brian that the reason she needed more money was to help her family. Brian said he totally understood how important taking care of family was to Victoria, but he said, you're one of 5 kids and you're giving too much money to your siblings. Now, even though Brian did not specifically say this, Victoria knew what Brian was really saying was there was one sibling in particular that Victoria was helping that Brian did not agree with, and that was one of her brothers. The young man had a very serious history of drug use, and Brian was very sure he was just throwing away the money Victoria was giving him to feed his drug addiction. But ultimately, Brian knew it was Victoria's decision what she did with her money, and so Brian said he would call his office and see what he could do about moving the money. But he urged Victoria to really think hard about whether it was worth giving away all this money. After Victoria hung up, she found herself thinking about her family. After she had gotten that court settlement, her first instinct was to use that money to better the lives of everybody in her family, and she had done that, and she was really happy about it. And so even though she knew Brian was making a good point that maybe it was not the best decision to give all her money away to her siblings, she just felt like she had to. And in fact, she couldn't even imagine not helping her siblings or her family out at this point. In particular, her brother who was struggling with drugs. In fact, Victoria believed her kind of red flag brother deserved the most help out of anybody because of his drug use. A couple of minutes later, Victoria called out to Marlene and asked her to come into the study. When she did, Marlene took Victoria and wheeled her to Victoria's bedroom. There, Marlene massaged Victoria's legs like she did every night, and then she helped her get ready for bed. They talked through their plan for the following day. Destiny had to be at school early, and then Victoria wanted to go see her stepfather. Then after that, they said goodnight to each other, and then Marlene stepped out of the room. For a little while, Victoria just lay awake in bed, feeling more stressed out than usual. And the reason she was stressed was about her money. She was thinking about what Brian said and whether or not it was a good idea to be giving all her money to her siblings and her family. And Victoria, she hated thinking about money. It really stressed her out to begin with. But she also told herself that she was going to see her stepfather the following day, and he always had great advice for her. And so maybe he would have some great financial advice. And so with that in mind, and also Victoria's steadfast belief that, no matter her problems, God had a plan for her, Victoria was able to eventually drift off to sleep. The next morning, so November 25th, 2011, Victoria and Marlene woke up early and made Destiny breakfast and got her off to school. Then, back at the apartment, Marlene helped Victoria get ready to go see her stepfather. But right as they were about to leave, there was a knock at the front door. Marlene walked across the living room and opened the door, but there was nobody there. She looked out into the street, but didn't see anybody walking off. Then Marlene looked down at the porch, and she saw there was this large, shiny green and gold gift bag that had no tag on it, and so Marlene just picked it up and stared for a second, wondering who had sent it and who it was for. Marlene walked back inside carrying the gift, and she told Victoria that she didn't think it was a good idea to open it right now because they had no idea where it came from. But Victoria thought Marlene was acting paranoid. To Victoria, this gift was clearly just an early Christmas present. Marlene disagreed and even suggested they should call the police. Victoria rolled her eyes and said that was a huge overreaction, but she could tell Marlene felt really uncomfortable about this gift, so Victoria promised she would not open it up. Marlene put the gift in the kitchen, and then she and Victoria left and went to go see Victoria's stepfather, who lived only a few minutes away. When they got there, Victoria's stepfather greeted the two women with a huge smile on his face, and he welcomed them into his home. A few minutes after they got there, Marlene helped Victoria to the shower. Victoria's stepfather's shower was actually much more accessible than her own, and so Victoria really enjoyed using it anytime she visited. But the shower also gave her an excuse to catch up with her stepfather. The two had been very close since he came into Victoria's life when she was a young girl, and she often turned to him for advice. So, after her shower, Victoria told her stepfather about the money issues she was having that she spoke to her financial advisor, Brian, about the day before. And just like Brian, Victoria's stepfather was also pretty visibly concerned about the fact that Victoria's money was dwindling so quickly. He told her that it was noble that she liked to help everybody she loved, but she needed to remember that that money was hers, and taking care of herself and her daughter should really be her priority, not everybody else. They talked a while longer, and then eventually Victoria asked him if he knew anything about the early Christmas present that had just shown up on her doorstep. At this point, Marlene jumped into the conversation and told Victoria's stepfather that there hadn't been a card or a tag or anything on this present, and she hadn't seen who had left it at the door. And then Marlene said, I told Victoria that we should not only not open this gift, but we should also call the police and let them handle it. And as Victoria's stepfather listened to this, he too started feeling pretty paranoid about this gift. And he told Victoria that, you should call the police and definitely do not open that bag. You don't know what it is. Victoria couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why was everybody so worried about this early Christmas present? Come on. But at the same time, Victoria did not want to upset people, so she told her stepfather that she would not open the gift. A little bit later, Victoria thanked her stepfather for having them over. She told him she loved him, and then she and Marlene headed home. They got back to the apartment just before 9 a.m. Marlene walked right to the kitchen and began washing dishes from breakfast. She grabbed a plate off the counter and began running water over it, when suddenly there was this huge bang that echoed through the apartment, and the entire apartment shook, and parts of the ceiling began coming down. And Marlene, she began screaming because she had no idea what was going on. She figured this must be an earthquake, but she didn't know. And so after a second of just pure terror and shock, Marlene turned and ran out of the kitchen and went into the living room yelling out for Victoria, because again, she has no idea what's going on here. But when Marlene saw Victoria, she was slumped forward in her wheelchair and blood was pouring out of her neck. And so Marlene just ran through all the dust and the smoke in the room and went out the front door and just started screaming for help at the top of her lungs. A neighbor who lived not far from Victoria's small apartment building had come out of his house after hearing that very loud noise. And now he looked up the street and he saw Marlene screaming for help. And so the neighbor immediately grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and ran to Marlene. And when he reached Marlene, he could see very clearly that she had cuts on her body and she was bleeding. But Marlene kept saying, "Somebody needs to go inside. Victoria needs help." And the neighbor happened to be a former volunteer firefighter, so he ran into the apartment without hesitation. Once he was inside, there was all this dust and smoke in the air, and it really made it hard to breathe, and he began to cough. But eventually, after walking through the haze, he saw Victoria in her wheelchair, and so he rushed over to her, and he saw she wasn't moving, and so he reached down to check for a pulse or any sign of life. But after a few seconds of just looking at Victoria, it was clear she was already deceased. And so the neighbor ran back out of the house and sat down next to Marlene, who was collapsed on the ground crying, and just took her hand and tried to comfort her as best as he could as they waited for the emergency personnel to arrive. Seconds later, fire trucks, police cruisers, and an ambulance roared through the small town of Innisfail, and they arrived in front of Victoria's apartment just minutes after the neighbor had made that 911 call. First responders helped Marlene and the neighbor off the lawn and then tended to Marlene's cuts. There was no active fire going on inside the apartment, but still, firefighters were the first to go inside. And when they got in there, they quickly identified that clearly an explosion had happened inside of this apartment. And from what they were seeing, the explosion had not been accidental. Someone had set off an incendiary device. And so the firefighters went back outside, and they would contact local, regional, and national authorities about what they had just found inside of the apartment. Not long after those calls, members of the explosives disposal unit arrived. Members of the EDU are national and regional Canadian police officers trained to detect, disarm, and dispose of explosive devices like bombs. Several EDU officers filed out of a truck in front of Victoria's apartment. They wore these huge 90-pound bomb suits made from protective materials like Kevlar, and they had helmets and blast shields that covered their heads and faces. Several of Marlene's neighbors had come out onto their porches to watch, and from their perspective, it almost looked like a group of astronauts had invaded their street. Inside of Victoria's apartment, the explosives unit did a thorough sweep of every room to make sure there was no longer a bomb threat, and they concluded that the apartment was clear, and so it was time now for investigators and forensic analysts to take over. Corporal Kenmore-Deep DeHill of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is Canada's national police force, arrived at Victoria's apartment with several forensic investigators right behind him. DeHill quickly met with the officers who had gotten to the scene first, and they filled him in with information they had taken from Marlene. They told him the woman who had died inside the apartment was Victoria Shockday. She was 23 years old, and she was a quadriplegic. The officers also said that Marlene had told them about some sort of mysterious gift that had been dropped off outside of the apartment earlier that morning without any kind of card or tag on it. DeHill nodded and then scanned the street. The neighbors had now gotten even closer to the scene, trying to figure out what had happened. The officers pushed them back and told them they needed to stay a safe distance away from Victoria's apartment. Amidst this growing crowd, DeHill saw Marlene. She was sitting with first responders with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He could tell she was in shock. DeHill wanted to talk to her, but first he wanted to get a better idea of what he was dealing with. So he thanked the officers he was talking with for their help, and then DeHill stepped inside the apartment. Forensics analysts told him that they had already found pieces of a galvanized steel pipe, traces of gunpowder, and a lantern battery, clear signs of a homemade bomb. DeHill tried to take in the entire scene. Parts of the walls and floors had been ripped apart, pieces of furniture had gaping holes in them, debris were scattered everywhere, and strands of plaster hung down from the ceiling like confetti. But the real horror was where Victoria was, in the dining room. DeHill walked into the dining room and approached Victoria. She was sitting in her wheelchair with her head slumped forward. DeHill saw multiple serious wounds on Victoria's neck, as well as bloodstains on her skin and all over her torn clothes. DeHill didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but he had been a member of the Major Crimes Unit for years, and he knew that homicides involving pipe bombs like this were often connected to drug gangs. But that just didn't make sense to DeHill. The victim was a young woman who was paralyzed and who had no criminal history at all. Why would she be mixed up with a drug gang? Corporal DeHill made his way down the hall to the bedrooms. He looked into Destiny's bedroom, and all he could think was how glad he was that Victoria's little girl had been at school when this happened. Minutes later, someone shouted for DeHill out in the dining room. So DeHill stopped what he was doing, and he walked down the hall to the dining room, and when he got there, DeHill saw a forensics officer crouched down, staring at something on the ground. She was staring at something that she just uncovered from the dust and the pieces of the ceiling that had fallen to the floor, and she could not believe what she was looking at. DeHill knelt down beside her, and he looked at what she was staring at, and what he saw was a piece of paper with Victoria's name written on it in colored ink. Marlene had previously told the officers that this Christmas present they received did not have a tag on it, but this piece of paper definitely looked like a tag that would go on a gift, at least to DeHill. The forensics officer told DeHill that finding a scrap of paper like this fully intact after an explosion was almost unheard of. And that little piece of paper gave DeHill a jolt of energy, because it could possibly offer a handwriting sample of the bomber. And even more importantly, potentially there could be the bomber's DNA on the paper. So the forensics team bagged up the piece of paper for testing and then continued looking for evidence all throughout the apartment. Later that day, DeHill finally stepped outside of the apartment, and the fresh air felt like it might knock him over. He hadn't realized how difficult it was to breathe inside of the apartment. DeHill caught his breath and then noticed Marlene standing by the road with several officers. The wounds that Marlene had suffered during the explosion wound up being quite minor, so she was able to answer any questions that the officers had. And so DeHill saw this as his chance, and so he walked over to her and introduced himself. Marlene wiped away the tears from her face, and then she told DeHill that she had warned Victoria not to open that gift. And so when DeHill heard this, he followed up with, "Well, Marlene, why were you so worried about this gift? Did you think somebody was planning to attack Victoria?" But Marlene would say, in response to this, that her suspicion about the present had nothing to do with fear that somebody was out to hurt Victoria. She just didn't trust the fact that this present had been dropped off completely randomly a month before the holidays with no tags on it, nothing. It just seemed like something was off about this gift. And then after that, Marlene just sort of broke down. She told DeHill that people loved Victoria and looked to her as an inspiration. Victoria had endured so much for someone so young, but she never let anything stop her. In fact, Victoria often went out of her way to help other people who needed it, whether it was by giving money to her family or volunteering at her church. She was just a very thoughtful person. DeHill told Marlene how sorry he was for her loss and for what she had been through that morning with the explosion. DeHill knew Marlene was physically okay, but he was sure she would never get over what had happened. Then he thanked her for her time and walked back towards the apartment. And as he was on his way, one thing Marlene had said to DeHill really stood out to him, that Victoria apparently gave money to her family. Money, family, and murder often went hand in hand, so DeHill instructed members of his team to begin looking into Victoria's financial situation, and he asked others to track down members of her family for questioning. DeHill still had not formed any serious theories or opinions about who could have delivered this pipe bomb, but he thought maybe in this case, a family dispute over money that maybe erupted into violence might make more sense than a drug gang putting out a hit on somebody like Victoria. So DeHill just needed to figure out who all Victoria was giving money to and who would have benefited from her death. On the night of Victoria's murder, and during the following day, Corporal DeHill and members of his team had contacted and took statements from Victoria's family and friends, and they all basically said the same thing. They loved Victoria. She was a beautiful person and an amazing mother, and they couldn't imagine who would want to hurt her. And Victoria's family were very upfront about the financial aid she had given them all since she'd received her court settlement. But they all insisted that they never wanted to feel like a burden to Victoria and that she helped them because it was something she wanted to do. Now, despite how honest the family and friends seemed to DeHill, he couldn't actually just rule them out because they seemed like good people. The reality was they still needed more information to get to the bottom of Victoria's financial situation to see if that played a role in whatever happened to her. And in conversations with family and friends, DeHill had learned that Victoria had a financial advisor, Brian Malley, who would obviously have a much fuller picture of Victoria's finances. And so DeHill reached out to Brian and asked him to come meet him at a nearby police station. Brian was a 55-year-old guy who was quite tall and had graying hair. He was known for being very polite and outgoing, traits that had really helped him grow his business. Brian told DeHill that he'd actually been a friend of Victoria's family for years, and he had really gotten to know Victoria when he did construction work on her apartment to make it more wheelchair accessible. He also said when he and Victoria began working together on her finances, that also really brought them together, so they were legitimately good friends. DeHill asked him about his investment strategy for Victoria, and Brian would say, the strategy was very standard. His goal was just to add to the money that Victoria already had. That way her and her daughter could be taken care of in the future. And then he also asked Brian if he could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Victoria. And when he asked that question, it was the first time Brian seemed to hesitate. And for a second, DeHill actually thought maybe Brian just didn't hear the question, and he was about to ask it again, but then Brian shook his head and broke the silence and said he just could not imagine anybody wanting to do this to Victoria. It just really didn't make sense. DeHill would ask Brian a few more questions, and Brian would do his best to answer, and then eventually DeHill thanked Brian for coming in, and Brian got up to leave. But even before Brian made it out the door, DeHill found himself thinking how strange it was that Brian had hesitated when he was asked, is there anybody out there that you think might want to hurt Victoria? Everybody else who DeHill had asked that question to, family, friends, witnesses, had all pretty much immediately said, no, there's no one. Nobody would want to hurt her, or certainly I don't know anybody who would want to hurt her. And Brian had basically had the same answer, but again, he had hesitated. And so it could have just been, a brain fart or he zoned out or something, or maybe there was something more to the hesitation. And so DeHill decided he was going to get to the bottom of it. And DeHill did not need to wait long to get his answer, because the following day, Brian contacted DeHill, and what he said cast Victoria's murder in a whole new light. Brian told DeHill that one of Victoria's brothers, who she gave money to all the time, had a very serious drug problem. He'd been addicted to crack for years. But that wasn't all. Brian also thought there was a real chance that Victoria's brother was a drug dealer and that he had gotten on the wrong side of some pretty serious drug gangs. And so by the time DeHill hung up with Brian, he felt like he had just caught his first major break in this case. One of DeHill's initial thoughts about the crime scene was that the type of homemade bomb used to kill Victoria was often used by people in the drug trade. So DeHill wondered if it was possible that Victoria's brother owed money to drug dealers or had encroached on their territory when dealing drugs on his own or something. And if that was the case, maybe those drug dealers killed Victoria to send a message to her brother. And so soon after this call with Brian, DeHill raced off to go speak with Victoria's brother. And when he did and actually began talking to him, the young man tried to be as helpful as he could, and he admitted openly to struggling with drugs in the past. But he said he never dealt drugs to anyone, and the idea that he had connections to major drug gangs was laughable. DeHill was not ready to just take this guy at his word, but one thing DeHill definitely noticed was Victoria's brother was visibly angry that somebody even suggested that he had something to do with his sister's death. He told DeHill he loved Victoria, probably more than he'd loved anybody else in the world. And so after this meeting ended, DeHill did not think he had just gotten any closer to solving the case. However, at the same time, he wasn't ready to just drop the possible connection between drugs and Victoria's murder. And so for now, at least, that was still the best lead he had. On December 3rd, 2011, so a week after Victoria's murder, 250 people gathered at a funeral home to say their final goodbyes to Victoria and to celebrate her life. DeHill and other police officers attended the funeral as well. It's common for investigators to go to funerals of murder victims to see how their friends and family and other potential suspects behave. DeHill listened to the people who were closest to Victoria talk about what an unbelievably amazing person she was, and as he listened to this, he just struggled to understand how someone as wonderful as Victoria ended up with a homemade pipe bomb getting delivered to her house. Now, DeHill had continued to pursue Victoria's brother's possible connection to drug gangs, and in doing that, he had discovered that years earlier, Victoria had made an anonymous call to the police about her neighbors dealing drugs. But DeHill still didn't know if that call had anything to do with her brother, or if somehow the neighbors had figured out who made the anonymous call and then took their revenge on Victoria. But DeHill just could not fathom why any drug dealer would wait years to exact their revenge for a phone call to the cops that didn't really amount to much. A procession of mourners made their way towards Victoria's casket, but DeHill focused on Victoria's young daughter, Destiny. Whoever had done this to Victoria, whether they were connected to the drug trade or not, had robbed this little girl of her mother and robbed her of a safe, happy childhood. Seeing Destiny struggling so hard just to talk about her mother made DeHill so mad. And he was also very frustrated that still he had not honed in on one or two major suspects yet. But still, DeHill tried to stay steady and level-headed. He had plenty of information to work with. He just needed more time to figure out what it all meant. After the funeral, DeHill returned to the station and met with his team. He decided this case could very well hinge on the old adage, follow the money. If they could track where Victoria's money went after she gave it to her brother, it could lead them to the person or people they were looking for. So, for the next several weeks, investigators looked into Victoria's financial transactions dating back to when she had received her court settlement. And investigators were able to follow a paper trail of where and when Victoria's money moved. And something they found set off a major alarm. Finally, DeHill had a full picture of what Victoria had done with her money, and he was almost positive he now knew who had killed her. DeHill wanted to act fast, but he also wanted his case to be airtight if it went to trial. So he needed a key piece of evidence that he still lacked. Forensics investigators had managed to pull DNA samples from that piece of paper with Victoria's name on it that had somehow survived the explosion. So now, DeHill just had to secure a DNA sample from his newly discovered suspect to see if the DNA matched. Almost 6 months after Victoria's murder, 2 investigators trailed their suspect from an unmarked car. The Major Crimes Unit had secured a warrant that allowed them to conduct surveillance on DeHill's new primary suspect. The surveillance process had been very in-depth, and it had taken a lot of time, but it convinced DeHill even further that he was right about who had murdered Victoria. So now, these two investigators who were following this suspect needed to secure a DNA sample from this suspect to back up DeHill's theory. Eventually, the investigators saw the suspect turn off the street and pull into the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. The investigators could not believe their luck. This was the perfect place to get a DNA sample. From inside their unmarked car out in the parking lot, the investigators watched the suspect get out of their car and walk inside the restaurant. The investigators waited a minute, and then they too got out of their car and they went inside as well. The investigators bought food just to blend in, and then took a seat in a booth towards the back and kept an eye on their suspect. Eventually, the suspect finished their meal, threw their trash into the trash can, and walked outside. And at this point, the investigators sprung into action. They put gloves on their hands, walked over to the trash can, and began fishing around inside of it until they pulled out a napkin the suspect had used to wipe their hands and mouth, and they slipped that napkin into a paper bag. And soon after that, the napkin was sent off for DNA testing. It took a while for the results to come back, but when they did, they showed DeHill exactly what he had been looking for. They were a match. DeHill had found Victoria's murderer. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and police interviews, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on November 25, 2011, the morning that somebody murdered Victoria Schachté. The sun wouldn't rise for hours, but the killer was already hard at work. They sat at a wooden table staring at their creation. They had spent months collecting the necessary items to complete the project, and now they were finally ready to finish it and put it to use. The killer took a big breath in and exhaled slowly through their mouth. They told themselves that staying calm was key. Shaky hands or sudden movements could be very dangerous. The killer slowly put the finishing touches on the pipe bomb, then backed away from the table and let out a huge breath and felt their shoulders relax. They reached down and picked up a white cardboard box off the floor, and they carefully set the bomb inside of the box. They closed the box and then grabbed a piece of paper and a colored pen, and they wrote the word Victoria in large, festive-looking letters on the paper and then taped it to the top of the cardboard box. Finally, the killer picked up a large green and gold gift bag and placed the box inside. A few minutes later, the killer drove through Innisfail and arrived on Victoria's street. They drove a little ways past her apartment and then parked their car. Then, after pulling their dark cap down to cover their face, the killer stepped out of the car and looked up and down the street. It was empty. So they reached into the passenger seat and took the heavy gift bag containing the bomb, and they walked carefully towards Victoria's apartment. As they moved, they did their best to stay in the shadows and avoid the streetlights. Finally, the killer reached Victoria's apartment, and they placed the gift bag down right in front of the front door, and then the killer knocked on the door and then turned and ran away as fast as they could. By the time Marlene opened the door, the killer was already gone. Hours later, at around 9 a.m., Victoria and Marlene returned from Victoria's stepfather's house, and right away, Marlene headed to the kitchen to do the dishes. But while she was at the sink, she didn't hear or see Victoria, who wheeled herself into the kitchen as well, and Victoria grabbed the gift bag off the kitchen table where Marlene had left it, she put it on her lap, and then wheeled herself into the dining room. Victoria opened up the bag and saw there was a white cardboard box inside. She took the box out and let the bag fall to the floor. And when this happened, Victoria very likely saw that there was a tag on this box. There was that piece of paper that said Victoria in colorful ink. And so for Victoria, this very likely confirmed in her head that Marlene and her stepfather were overreacting about this box. Clearly, this was just an early Christmas present for Victoria, and it was no big deal. And so Victoria ultimately opened up the box. And when she did, the box exploded. And by the time the explosion actually happened, the killer had already arrived in Edmonton, where he had business to conduct, and where his wife was going to see the opera. Brian Malley, Victoria's family friend and her financial advisor, was her killer. It would turn out the image of a kind, outgoing, successful businessman that Brian showed the world was nothing more than an act that he had spent years cultivating. In reality, Brian was a former cop who had been kicked off the Edmonton police force about 3 years after he had joined. Brian's first wife had divorced him because she believed he was a physical threat to her and their daughter, and his second wife had also divorced him because Brian was having an affair with a coworker. But somehow, Brian had managed to hide all of that, and he sort of reinvented himself when he had moved to the small town of Innisfail. And soon, he had established himself as a reliable construction worker, and then later as an honest and trustworthy financial advisor. But the truth was, Brian never really changed, and he made a habit out of using his clients' money for his own gain, making risky and even illegal investments in the hope that he could make some big money on commissions. And he got away with it for a while. But in 2011, Victoria had started to wonder why her large investment account kept dwindling so quickly. When she had asked Brian about it, he just kept saying the problem was that Victoria gave too much of her money away to her family. But when Victoria continued to push him for more information about what was happening, Brian started to panic. Because he had actually invested over 90% of Victoria's money in a single, very high-risk stock. And that stock had just cratered, so almost all of Victoria's money was now gone. And Brian had never consulted Victoria about doing this investment, so she had no idea what had even happened. He also obviously never disclosed the inherent risk of putting so much money into a single stock. Basically, you can lose everything really quickly. Brian knew his actions violated multiple Canadian financial laws, so he decided the only way to avoid getting caught and going to jail was to kill Victoria and pin the murder on her own brother. Now, Victoria's brother had nothing to do with the murder, and it was never shown that he had ever dealt drugs. But ultimately, it was the investigators' initial pursuit of the brother's possible drug connection to this crime that had led DeHill and his team to uncover Brian's financial crimes. But even with all of this information about his financial crimes, DeHill needed something much more concrete to directly connect Brian to the murder. Luckily, that piece of paper Brian had written Victoria on and then taped to the bomb survived the blast, and DNA samples from that paper ended up matching the DNA sample taken from the napkin that Brian had thrown away when he was at the fast food restaurant. And so after finding that match, DeHill and his team moved in and arrested Brian. Brian was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and several charges related to constructing and delivering an explosive device. He was sentenced to life in prison with a chance for parole after 25 years. On the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024, an elderly woman named Janet Lee sat in front of her computer in an office on the second floor of her home in Newcastle, England. She was going over some recent bank statements, but it was kind of hard. She was distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. So Janet's boyfriend was a guy named Richard O'Connell, and he and Janet had been together for about 20 years. Now, despite not officially being married, they sort of functioned like a married couple. They lived together, they shared everything. In fact, Janet had even written Richard into her will. Janet thought her and Richard would be together forever. Clearly, if you're writing him into your will, and she assumed that that feeling was reciprocated, that Richard also felt like they were together forever. But lately, their relationship had gotten pretty rocky, and in fact, both of them had begun openly talking about the possibility that they might need to break up. Now, nothing was set in stone, and by no means were they destined for a breakup, but it was suddenly, a possibility, and that was really hard for Janet to deal with. And so, as Janet sat upstairs trying to do these bank statements, but, getting completely sidetracked just by the sound of Richard's voice, part of the reason that was so distracting is, Richard was all she could think about. What would happen if they broke up? What would her life look like? And so before long, her mind was kind of wandering, and no longer was it the bank statements. It was, what does the future hold for me? It seems so uncertain. And so as Janet is having this moment upstairs, she suddenly hears Richard start yelling downstairs. And at first, it kind of sounded like maybe he was yelling at the person he had been talking to. But the more Janet listened, she could tell it really wasn't that he was yelling as much as he was screaming, like he was screaming out in pain or something.
And so Janet got out of her chair and ran downstairs to see what was going on. And when she did, she looked towards the front door and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize, but he looked weirdly familiar to her. He was wearing a white lab coat, his back was to her, and he was walking out the front door. And before she could even begin to process who this guy was and what he was doing here, she heard the sound of Richard again kind of calling out in pain, less loudly this time, but definitely in real pain. Then she turned, and sure enough, there was Richard in the living room, clutching his shoulder and grimacing like something was really hurting him. And so Janet, she walked over to him and she's like, "What's going on? Like, what's wrong with you? And who was that guy? And like, tell me, what's happening here?" And so Richard, through gritted teeth, would tell her that he had just gotten a COVID vaccine shot and it really hurt. And that guy who had just given it to him was a guy from NHS, the National Health Service, and he just came by to administer the shot. And so Janet heard what he said, but it wasn't really computing. Like, why aren't you getting the shot done at the doctor's office? Why are you having somebody come here to administer it? That's unusual. But, as she was thinking about this, she could clearly see that what was really important right now was that Richard was in agonizing pain. I mean, he was holding his arm and kind of rocking back and forth, moaning. Clearly, he was having some sort of reaction to the shot. And so she forgot about the weirdness around why he got the shot and how he got the shot, and said to him, like, "Hey, do you want to go to the hospital? I can drive you." And at this, Richard kind of sat up straight and took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm himself down. And even though obviously his shoulder still hurt from the shot, he said to Janet that, the guy from the NHS told me this was normal. There's pain associated with this particular shot, and it would just go away on its own. And so I'm just gonna wait and let this thing fade. At this point, Janet was still worried about Richard, but he seemed pretty confident that this was not a big deal, and so she decided she would simply follow his lead. And she said, "Okay, if that's what you want to do." And then she turned and she went upstairs and continued trying to do her bank statements. But 2 days later, Janet did end up driving Richard to the hospital, because over those 48 hours since Richard got that COVID shot, the spot on his arm, the injection site, had turned red and began to blister and bleed, and then eventually it turned black. And so at that point, they went to the ER. Hospital doctors would diagnose Richard with something called necrotizing fasciitis, which is a bacterial infection more commonly known as flesh-eating disease. Basically, the skin and muscle of Richard's arm was dying and rotting, but from the inside out. The doctors told Richard he would have to have emergency surgery to remove the rotting flesh to stop the spread of this infection. But before they could even do that, they needed to figure out how this infection had even begun. And so at this point, Richard began telling the doctors all about how, 2 days earlier he'd gotten his COVID shot, and pretty much right away it had been so painful, and then it blistered and bled and turned black. And then also, over the course of this discussion that Janet is listening to as well, Richard began describing the NHS guy who had actually come to his house. Now remember, Janet had only seen this guy for a brief second when she had run downstairs. She had seen him walking out the front door, she just saw the white lab coat, but something about him seemed weirdly familiar, but she kind of put that thought out of her mind. But now, as she's listening to Richard describe this NHS guy with a little more detail this time, suddenly something clicked. She realized she knew why this guy seemed so familiar, and this realization filled her with horror. It would turn out that NHS nurse was not really an NHS nurse. Instead, they were a man that both Janet and Richard knew very well. However, they were extremely well disguised, and so Janet and Richard did not recognize them. This man's name was Thomas Kwan, and Thomas, after coming inside their home, did not inject Richard with COVID-19 vaccine. Instead, he injected Richard with a deadly pesticide called iodomethane. That pesticide immediately caused that excruciating pain that Richard was feeling that caused him to scream out, and ultimately killed and began to rot away the flesh in his arm. It would turn out Thomas Kwan was Janet's son, and he was furious at her for putting Richard in her will and allowing Richard to get her house when she died. And so he decided he would basically inject poison into Richard, killing Richard to secure the house for himself. But Richard would survive the ordeal. He would have to undergo several pretty intense surgeries, but he ended up being okay. As for Thomas, he was arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 31 years in prison. next and final story of today's episode is called Clocked Out. On the afternoon of July 29, 2016, a 23-year-old college student named Felix stood in the break room of the industrial manufacturing company where he worked in northwestern Germany. He poured some cereal into a bowl, and then he took his carton of milk out of the communal fridge, and then with the cereal and his milk, he sat down at a table with two of his coworkers. So Felix was studying to become an engineer, and that was his primary focus, and on his breaks from school, he would work here as a machine mechanic. But as a result of that, basically just being a college kid looking for a side gig, it made him one of the youngest people at this company. And so oftentimes, Felix had a hard time relating to his coworkers, who were all basically a lot older than him. And in fact, now, as he sat down to eat his cereal, the two coworkers that were sitting there already, these two men named Otto and Klaus, who were in their 50s, it's like they didn't even look up and acknowledge him. They just continued silently eating their sandwiches as if Felix wasn't even there. At first, Felix put up with the fact that this lunch break so far was pretty awkward. Like there was no conversation happening here. He definitely felt like he did not belong here. But eventually, the silence was deafening at this table, and Felix just couldn't stand it. And so he said to his coworkers, Klaus and Otto, hey guys, how's the day going? And Klaus looked up and stared at Felix, and he just shrugged, said nothing, and went back to eating his food. Now, Klaus, admittedly, was known as sort of a loner employee who kind of kept to himself, so this behavior was somewhat normal, although somewhat off-putting to Felix, who's trying to obviously start a conversation here. But then Otto, he looked up, and he looked at Felix, and he was about to say something, but then paused, and this grimace came over his face, and he just said to Felix, you know what? I'm not having a good day. My head hurts, my stomach hurts, I feel tired, I feel kind of awful. And so now Felix is like, okay, sorry, Otto, I don't know what to tell you. That's tough. Now, Felix didn't know how to make this any less awkward, and so he just went back to eating his cereal in silence, and then when he was done, he got up and left the awkward break room. But Felix had only been back to his job for a couple of minutes when suddenly he felt this intense stomach cramp that made him double over in pain. Now, Felix actually was somewhat accustomed to getting cramps like this one because he was lactose intolerant. And typically, if he consumed dairy, shortly thereafter, he would get these stabbing pains in his stomach. That's actually why he kept a carton of his own milk in the communal fridge that was lactose-free. And so suddenly, Felix wondered if maybe he had accidentally grabbed the wrong milk when he had poured his cereal just now. Had he grabbed regular milk, causing this pain? And so as a wave of nausea came over him, Felix sprinted back into the break room, opened up the communal fridge to see if he had grabbed the wrong milk, but he saw there was actually only one container of milk in the fridge, and it was his, the lactose-free kind. And so he had no idea what was actually causing these cramps because it couldn't have been dairy. But at this point, Felix was just so nauseous that all he could think about now was the fact that he could no longer work today. He had to go home. And so Felix told his supervisor he had to go, and then he rushed out to his car, he sped home, and barely made it into his bathroom in time in order to vomit into the toilet. And after he vomited, he felt a little bit better, and so he wiped his mouth, and he stood up straight, took a deep breath, and then he went to the sink, and he splashed some water on his face, and he grabbed the towel, and he went to dry his face, and as he did, he noticed something. He noticed the tips of his fingers were now tingling, like his hands were going numb. And so reflexively, he put down the hand towel and began flexing and opening and closing his hands over and over again to increase the circulation to his fingers, to maybe get the feeling back, but nothing he did seemed to help. And at this point, Felix couldn't help but feel a little bit scared. Now, stomach cramps and nausea were somewhat normal symptoms for him, considering, again, he was lactose intolerant. Those were normal symptoms of illness. But losing circulation in your hands was not something he was used to. This was something else. And so even though Felix was an adult, he was 23 years old, his first thought was, I gotta call my mom. And so that's what he did. Two weeks later, Felix was still sick. On his mother's advice, he had gone to see his doctor, and his doctor had told him that he was very likely just overworked, and he prescribed Felix some vitamins and rest. But those two things had not helped Felix. In fact, really, his symptoms had only gotten worse. He was still nauseous, and that tingling feeling he had felt in his hands had now extended all the way up into his forearms. And so as a result of this mystery illness afflicting Felix, he had not been able to go back to work. and he had spent the better part of the last 2 weeks just lying miserably in bed. But this morning, he was determined to get out of bed, take a shower, have a real meal, and basically just have a normal day. And so it started relatively well. He managed to, prop himself up and get out of bed. But as he staggered his way towards the bathroom, he lost his balance and had to grab onto the door to keep from falling to the ground. After steadying himself, Felix did attempt to keep walking towards the bathroom, but it was like the commands from his brain were not reaching his legs. And so he kept slipping and staggering and almost falling. And so eventually he just turned around to go back to bed, but immediately he kind of collapsed to the ground and had to literally crawl painstakingly back to the bed. And then when he had finally pulled himself back on there, he pulled out his phone and called his mom again. But this time he was not calling for advice. He was calling for help. He needed her to drive him to the hospital. Later that afternoon, Felix laid in a hospital bed with his mother to his left and an emergency room neurologist to his right. The neurologist had heard about Felix's symptoms, and she was now performing a preliminary examination, which really consisted of lots of questions about Felix's drug use, about, a history of neurological problems in their family, had he had any recent head injuries. But basically all the questions she was asking him, he said no to. There weren't any precursors to him having these issues. Next, the neurologist poked Felix's arms to see what he could feel, because he was complaining of numbness and tingling, but it was kind of like wherever she poked in his arms, he couldn't really feel it. It was like the tingling sensation had totally taken over both arms. That's all he could feel. After that, she measured his muscle reflexes in his legs and also shined a light in both his eyes. And then after that, she put her tools down and she looked at Felix with a very worried expression on her face. She said that based on Felix's symptoms, she thought that some part of his nervous system, like his brain or his spinal cord, might be inflamed. And this type of inflammation can lead to things like nausea, numbness, and loss of coordination, all things Felix had been experiencing. And this inflammation could be caused by a number of different infections or an autoimmune reaction. But to know for sure, she would have to run some more tests, and so she advised Felix to be admitted to the hospital. Six days later, the neurologist went to check in on Felix, who was still at the hospital. And as soon as she walked into his room and saw Felix, she saw he looked terrible. His body was limp, his face was swollen, and his eyes were sort of glazed over, like he was staring off into the distance. By this point, doctors had run imaging scans on Felix and had discovered that his brain and brainstem were inflamed, like the neurologist had suspected. But the neurologist could not figure out why this was happening. Typically, inflammation like this was caused by an infection, but the neurologist had tested Felix for every infection she could think of that could have caused this, and all those tests had come back negative. So her new working theory was Felix must be having an extreme autoimmune reaction, which is basically when your immune system malfunctions and starts attacking your own body. Autoimmune reactions can cause things like brain swelling. But this theory didn't really help Felix very much. Because first of all, it was nearly impossible to test to see if this theory was even true, that it was an autoimmune reaction. And second of all, even if you knew that's what it was, unfortunately, autoimmune reactions are notoriously difficult to treat. Basically, it was a shaky diagnosis that did not come with an easy cure. The neurologist had given Felix some anti-inflammatory medication, hoping that maybe that would help, based on her research around autoimmune diseases, but it basically did nothing. And she knew that if she didn't find a way to lower the swelling in his brain and brainstem, that Felix could potentially suffer permanent brain damage or even death. So now, in Felix's hospital room, the neurologist walked over to him and tapped his shoulder, and she asked him how he was feeling. And Felix, when he sort of looked up at her, his eyes were rolled back in his skull, and it took a minute for him to focus on her, and then it was clear to the neurologist that it took all of his energy to croak out an answer. But the words he said didn't make any sense. He said, "Metal, mouth." And the neurologist said, "What? What are you trying to say?" And then he said, "Taste, water." And at that point, the neurologist realized what Felix was trying to say is that he had a metallic taste in his mouth and he wanted a cup of water to clear his mouth. The neurologist felt like this had to be a clue about what was going on with Felix, It was not some random symptom, like this has to be connected to the totality of what was wrong with him, but she didn't know what a metallic taste in his mouth had to do with his other symptoms, and so she was baffled. So she just grabbed a cup of water off the nearby table and handed it to Felix, and Felix immediately put it to his lips and tried to drink it, but it was like he couldn't, and the water just dribbled down his chin onto his chest. And as the neurologist stared at her patient, she couldn't help but feel like she was just totally failing here. I mean, obviously there was something horribly wrong with Felix, but she had not come up with a proper diagnosis yet, and all the medications and treatments she had suggested so far had done nothing for his symptoms, and she knew if she couldn't get the swelling to go down, it was just a matter of time before he suffered permanent brain damage or death. And so at this point, the neurologist realized a big change would have to be made in Felix's care. Clearly what she was doing was not working, and so she decided to transfer him from her hospital to a local university hospital where she knew there were some specialists there who they might be able to figure out what was going on here. But the next day, at that university hospital, that team of specialists that had been assigned to Felix's case were just as baffled as the neurologist had been. Because now, Felix didn't just have swelling in his brain and a metallic taste in his mouth. He also was experiencing kidney and liver failure. And this collection of symptoms meant Felix very likely did not have an autoimmune condition. They tested him again for more infections that, maybe could still leave the possibility open that it was an autoimmune condition, but again, those still all came back negative. And so effectively, these specialists who were here to, solve this puzzle were back at square one. They had made no further progress. And so at this point, all Felix's doctors could do was just hope that whatever illness was plaguing Felix would sort of resolve itself on its own. And they would just, do their best to manage his symptoms and try to keep him comfortable until it did. However, by September of 2016, so 2 months after that first day that Felix went home sick from work, he had not improved. He spent most of his time laying in bed unconscious, barely clinging to life. At this point, most of these specialists were just monitoring Felix. However, one of them still felt like a diagnosis here was still possible. We just need to keep looking. And so this doctor actually decided that instead of monitoring Felix, he was going to start looking into some medical research papers. Because he figured, whatever Felix had to be really, really rare. If it wasn't, they would have figured it out by now, and they clearly had not. So he must have something rare. And if there's one place you can go to learn about very rare conditions and diseases, it's medical research papers. And so he began combing through all these papers, and sure enough, he would actually find a case about another patient who had the exact same symptoms as Felix, and they even appeared in the exact same order. First, the stomach cramps and nausea, followed by the tingling in the arms, then the loss of coordination in the legs, then the swelling of the brain, followed by the metallic taste in the mouth, and then ultimately kidney and liver failure. And just like Felix, this patient's diagnosis in this medical journal was not an infection, nor was it an autoimmune disease. Instead, it was a condition that was so rare, it had only been recorded 3 times anywhere in the world over the last century. But this doctor understood that even though Felix's symptoms did appear to match, it still was highly unlikely he actually had this diagnosis because it's so unbelievably rare. However, the doctor thought, well, I'll just rule this condition out. All I need to do is a simple blood test. And so he did this blood test on Felix, literally believing it would just rule this out, except when the results came back, it was positive. This doctor had just solved the case, the one that nobody else seemed able to do. But the doctor was not happy. Instead, as he stared at the test results, he was kind of horrified because this diagnosis was a death sentence for Felix. There was no cure for this. And worse, this diagnosis meant other people potentially could be in danger here. And so the doctor knew his next step, of course, would be to contact Felix's family and tell them what he had discovered. But he also knew this was no longer just a medical problem. The doctor called local law enforcement, and they began their investigation immediately. They interviewed basically everyone Felix ever interacted with on a regular basis, and they also sent forensic technicians to all the places that Felix spent any time. And these technicians ran tests on all the surfaces that Felix might have touched at one point or another. They also ran tests on the food and the water that he might have consumed. They even at one point tried to test the air that Felix had potentially breathed. And they did all this because they were trying to find one very specific substance. But despite basically looking everywhere in Felix's life for weeks and weeks, they didn't find it. Meanwhile, Felix's condition only got worse. By the end of September, he had slipped into a vegetative state. But at least so far, the doctor's worst fears had not been realized. They actually expected other people to begin to turn up to hospitals with similar symptoms as Felix, but they hadn't. So, with no answers, but with no other victims either, the police investigation began to wind down. Felix remained in a vegetative state for months and then years, and officials still just had no idea how this actually happened to him. They just kind of concluded that, well, this was a horrible tragedy that very likely will never actually be explained. But at least hopefully it will never happen to anyone else. But then, 2 years after Felix fell into his coma, some very strange things began to happen at his old manufacturing job. So at this manufacturing company where Felix used to work, it actually was pretty commonplace for employees there to get sick fairly regularly, like more than normal. However, their illnesses were sort of basic. Things like headaches and stomach aches and feeling sort of tired. Things that didn't really raise big red flags. But now, Otto, the middle-aged man who had complained to Felix over their lunch break about his stomach and his head hurting, was going into kidney failure. And in fact, he was so sick he couldn't come to work anymore and had to get dialysis 3 times a week just to live. And also, another much younger employee, whose name was Elias, he was 26 years old, he had begun having stomach aches. Now, again, that was fairly common at this company, but for Elias, these were not normal stomach aches. These were crippling, severe, like you can't focus on anything else type of stomach aches, similar to the ones Felix was having. Now, Otto and Elias had not spoken to each other about their respective illnesses. This was a place where people just kind of got sick periodically and kept it to themselves. It was just not really that big of a deal. So they hadn't talked to each other, and they certainly had not connected what was happening to them to Felix and his illness, which was now over 2 years before. But that would all change one day in May of 2018, so again, we're still talking about 2 years since Felix went into his coma, when Elias was having his lunch in the company break room, and he would discover something that would connect everything and blow this case wide open. Elias's shocking discovery led police to do a search of a local home. And at first, this home seemed totally ordinary until they went down into the basement. Because down there, it looked like a mad scientist's laboratory. There was this metal table with all these beakers and scales on it, and then behind it were all these shelves that were stacked high with old jam jars and paint cans and even old mayonnaise bottles. And it would turn out, inside of these mismatched containers was a collection of deadly chemicals that a judge would later say were more toxic and more deadly than the literal chemical weapons that were used during World War I. This basement laboratory belonged to Klaus. He was one of the 2 employees that Felix sat with during that very awkward lunch break. The one was Otto, who told Felix he didn't feel very good, and the other was Klaus, the man who, when asked how his day was going, just looked up at Felix, shrugged his shoulders, and said nothing. It would turn out, for years, Klaus had been buying deadly chemicals online, mixing them together, and then sort of testing these concoctions on his coworkers. He would just poison their lunches and see what happened. Felix's very rare disease that only 3 people had experienced in the past century in the whole world was effectively extremely acute mercury poisoning. Basically, an ungodly high level of mercury poisoning. Because Klaus was literally just putting mercury into Felix's cereal, and he was just eating it up. In addition to poisoning Felix's cereal, Klaus also put lead literally right on top of Elias's sandwiches, and then he also put a combination of lead and cadmium into Otto's food. Klaus was only caught because Elias made that big discovery. While he was eating his lunch, he noticed there was a strange powder sitting on top of his sandwich, and so he called the police. Klaus never explained his motives for the poisonings. In March of 2019, he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. And unfortunately, 10 months after that, Felix, who had been in a vegetative state for 3 years to that point, passed away. As for Elias and Otto, they still suffer from long-term effects of chemical poisoning.
Something pressure heavy, sleep like mine never ready. Dreams folded in my backpack, Rent due, hope getting shaky. They said do what you love, but they never pay my phone. So I work all night for future that don't answer when I call home. Eyes red, heart racing, coffee instead of peace. I don't chase fame or fortune, I just wanna breathe. Deadline dreams, chasing me, running fast but stuck in between. Deadline dreams, no reset, living life on low percent.
Shadows awake the cries of my babies. My waking mind can understand who suffers love to feed their young. A new vision of hereafter where I can be both held and whole. Look into me with white sun moon eyes, whispering, my love, your time's come. I've searched through rain and starless skies and broken lives, dreaming you. There is a war that rages on all sides, a war inside of you. You're caught raging.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories,